I think this morning we are about to witness a defining moment in Irish history. When was the last time that you saw leaders representing diverse groups, representing every sector in Irish society, coming together to sing off the same hymn sheet? This morning we have leaders from the farming community, business community, environmental activists and the Irish Congress Trade Union come together to voice their outright opposition to CETA, the toxic trade deal between the EU and Canada, which, if ratified, will be the single biggest surrender of our sovereignty since the signing of the Act of Union in 1800. I'm going to introduce you now to each of our speakers this morning. They'll speak for about 3 minutes, outlining their group's concerns around CETA. And we'll begin with Patrick Kent. Patrick is president of the Irish Cattle and Sheep Farmers Association. And Patrick, you're very welcome, so you can.
Thanks very much, Anna. We in the ICSA are very, very concerned that this is a sellout. We're being used as a sacrificial lamb in this trade deal. There's a potential to bring in more than €1 billion euros worth of meat into the market of high price cuts from Canada and North America, I may add, that would be produced to much lower standards using products and so on that we do not use here in Europe and don't want to use, and our consumers do not want to consume. And we're also concerned about this trade deal that it will undermine our sovereignty and so on as well. But certainly our beef industry is certainly being jeopardised by this. It's been admitted by senior politicians in Europe and so on, and we certainly want this trade deal stopped.
I'd just like to say from the outset, the ICTU has a policy of outright opposition to CETA. And it's not very often that you find Congress with a position of outright opposition. But this is more important than other issues for us. Now, we're not in principle opposed to trade deals, but we're totally opposed to CETA for a variety of reasons, many of which will be dealt with by others at this press conference. I'm going to look at a few things: Canada's record at the ILO, the International Labour Organisation, the issue of public procurement, and very briefly ICS, because that will be dealt with in detail later. Of the ILO's 189 conventions, Canada has only ratified 34. Furthermore, it's only ratified 8 of the 31 ILO conventions developed since 1982. Give you a very clear idea of their attitude to labour rights. A couple of weeks ago, they ratified Convention number 98, the right to organise. Now, there's no coincidence it happened a couple of weeks ago. One could say this is the beginning of a charm offensive because, of course, Prime Minister Trudeau is visiting over the next few days, and in fact the General Secretary of the ICTU meets Premier Trudeau tomorrow, and I'm sure she will be giving him the message that I'm giving at this press conference. So, since 1982, the unions in Canada have filed more complaints at the ILO's Freedom of Association Committee than the national labour movements of any other country. So labour rights in Canada are way down the agenda. But irrespective of what they sign, CETA doesn't contain binding and enforceable measures to ensure ILO core labour standards are respected in a sustainable development chapter, while the public procurement provisions do not include explicit obligations to respect labour and environmental standards, nor promote the use of social and environmental criteria in public tenders. And that is important. You can sign up to something, but if you don't have enforcement mechanisms, it's not worth signing up to, really. Instead, it promotes workers' access to labour tribunals rather than recognising and explicitly accepting EU member states' workers' rights. Public procurement underwrites our social fabric, as local and national governments use public tenders to fulfil public policy choices. That means companies bidding for public contracts must abide by agreed criteria that may include social, labour or environmental sustainability clauses. CETA's procurement chapter fails to include any watertight clauses that uphold social criteria. Instead, contracts can be awarded to the most beneficial, quote, or, quote, the cheapest offer. CETA would therefore limit our ability to redefine and enhance the tools we use to achieve important public policy goals. Additionally, socially desirable or progressive labour legislation that might affect corporate profits would have to be notified to the stakeholders, that is, the EU Commission, Canadian Government and whoever they choose to have there in a corporate capacity 1 year in advance of every change, so they can be dealt with behind closed doors and perhaps never see the light of day. But irrespective of the ILO perspective, there still remains the overriding concern around ISDS, as it used to be called, renamed ICS. But like Windscale, which was renamed Sellafield, it remains just as toxic. Not only does this dispute settlement system accord transnational companies the right to sue sovereign states before arbitrary tribunals if their reasonable expectations of profits might be jeopardised by some legislative measure, but it directly threatens workers' terms and conditions. This was illustrated forcibly last year when Egypt was sued for attempting to raise the minimum wage. One can only imagine the list of possible measures: maternity leave, minimum annual holidays, extended unfair dismissals legislation, pension legislation, the list goes on. The inclusion of this provision is totally opposed by the ICTU, and we believe it unnecessary as our court system is sufficiently robust to deal with any problems that might arise in a trade deal. When it is realised that 50% of the Canadian economy is controlled by US transnationals, and the penetration of these companies in the Irish economy is considered, the potential impact of this provision becomes apparent, as they could sue Ireland through these subsidiaries, provided of course they're not simply brass plate subsidiaries. We support the contention of the European Trade Union Confederation that the right to regulate clauses in current trade agreements are not sufficient to protect public services and fundamental rights, as they do not specify any legal obligations or rights, are only declaratory and are an interpretive tool. We join the European Trade Union Confederation in calling for a progressive trade agenda, which means not only the inclusion of a social dimension in all trade agreements, but also the full preservation and improvement of the right of governments and authorities to regulate the economy in the public interest as they see fit. CETA is a trade deal for corporate interests. The Irish Congress of Trade Unions reiterates that workers will never accept any trade agreement that doesn't promote decent jobs and growth while safeguarding labour, consumer, environmental and health and safety standards. And we will remain in outright opposition to CETA until those demands are satisfied. Thank you.
Like all of the groups here this morning, the environmental pillar is not opposed to trade, but it is opposed to trade at any price. And we see CETA as a very, very bad deal, particularly for Ireland. Prime Minister Trudeau arrives tomorrow, and I'm sure in the lead up to Ireland's vote on the ratification of the CETA agreement, which each EU member state is now entitled to do, there will be a number of concessions for each of the sectors. There will be deals done, there will be sweeteners. But what Prime Minister Trudeau, nor the Irish government, nor any member state within the EU can do is change the text of the finalised negotiated agreement on CETA, which contains in Article 8 a provision to allow big business sue sovereign governments for taking actions and making policies which impact upon their profitability or their expectations of profitability. This is a fundamental shift for Ireland because despite the fact that we have one of the highest levels of foreign direct investment, we, unlike other EU member states, have not conceded to such mechanisms in the past in the same way as many other member states have. The real issue here is the extent of damages that effectively our government will be signing off on paying to foreign big business when they act in the public interest. Now, there is no two ways about it. CETA allows governments regulate, and our government has been emphatic in highlighting this. But it also allows our governments to be sued. And this is a fundamental change here for Ireland. This is a game changer. One of the biggest issues is not just the blank cheque and the payouts and the bailouts that our citizens and our taxpayers are going to be signed up to, but it is the regulatory chill effect, the fear of being sued, and how that prevents governments from acting in the public interest. We have seen this time and time again in other jurisdictions when big tobacco and various other different companies have gone after sovereign states. There's no two ways about it. ICS is reformed, but it's not sufficiently reformed. It is better than the old ISDS, but it does not equate to the same level of equality before the law nor independence of our judiciary that we enjoy in front of our national courts. Significant questions have been raised by very notable academics and leading legal organisations across Europe regarding the legality, the very legality of ICS under EU law. Wallonia won a concession in the lead up to the finalising of the agreement and its signing and authorisation in October, that there would be a reference to the Court of Justice. And we collectively are calling this morning on the Irish government to ensure there is no vote on ratification until the Court of Justice has ruled on the legality of ICS under EU law. This is a fundamental prerequisite for the Irish, the members of Dáil Éireann, who are the only people, I might add, who the government sees are entitled to vote on this, not our Senate. And it is fundamentally important that they have the benefit of that opinion from the Court of Justice before they make a ruling. I'll add one last point. It is very significant that the new deal, far more significant than the than the Canadian deal, the Japan trade deal, is not including ICS within it. The EU has actually dropped this toxic element, so it can fast track and ratify trade deals into the future. So why, in the name of God, would Ireland at this 11th hour concede to signing off on ICS in CETA? It may have court in the title, it's not a court. As one Canadian famously said, you can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. ICS is no court.
Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to take you through a few points from the perspective of small business. Our alliance works right throughout Europe and throughout the UK and in Ireland. We're a loose alliance that works principally on economic matters and competition law, competition policy, that area. First thing we'd say about CETA is called a trade deal, when in reality it is a corporate power grab, where money and corporate profit is the only show in town. There's only one winner: corpocracy. Has anyone ever gone to dinner or a wedding or a funeral with a corporation? I think not. Then why do we let corporations rule the world? They employ global lobbying firms who buy policy formation and policy implementation. They also buy international media. The EU Commission and EU Parliament are physically surrounded by global law firms and global lobbying firms. The rest of us, in our experience, are mere cannon fodder, whether we're SMEs, micro-enterprises, farmers or citizens at large. The first thing we should ask ourselves is who devised CETA, who promotes CETA, and finally who votes or has voted for CETA. Despite the fact that Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, members of the Oireachtas, have a very extremely limited knowledge of CETA, both parties blindly support CETA. But at whose behest? The European Parliament voted for CETA, but again at whose behest? CETA is part of a juggernaut, powering its way towards corporate dominance of the world. A frightening move from what was once a first world democracy to a new world of corpocracy, where our votes don't count, and for that matter, neither does the quality of the food we eat, the environment we live in, or the conditions under which we work. Just a word, Attracta has covered the ICS, the investor state settlement mechanisms. But what we would say about these is these mechanisms amount to little more than kangaroo corporate courts, which just happen to be unconstitutional. If a sovereign state introduces a rule, regulation, directive or law that might affect the corporation's profits, the corporation can go straight to the kangaroo corporate court to obtain damages. And who pays? You guessed, Joe Citizen once again. The chilling effect is the discouragement of the legitimate exercise of natural and legal rights by the threat of legal action. One can imagine the chilling effect of ICS mechanisms. One can only imagine how governments would use the chilling effect to underpin subservience to global corporations. ICS represents, as Anna said earlier, the last modicum of sovereignty from states that have signed up to it. They create a sort of private judiciary with one-way street system. Ireland is the only EU country that has not already signed up to an ICS mechanism, yet Ireland has by far the highest level of foreign direct investment. Think about that. Why would Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Labour want to sign up to ICS? Just a word on employment. The EU Employment and the EU Committee on Employment and Social Affairs has rejected CETA back in December 2016. The committee found that CETA would cost the EU 204,000 jobs. So where's the gain? Then there is the quality of employment, with challenges likely to be taken to future government decisions on minimum wage and zero-hour contracts. And just a little bit on food quality, because this is hugely important. Among the issues facing Irish farmers are high costs and low margins. Essentially, farming margins are squeezed between artificially high supply-side input costs and the dominant position employed by processors and multiple stores. As presently structured, Irish farmers cannot compete with their counterparts in Argentina, Brazil, the US, Canada. Long term, the only way in which Irish agriculture will survive is to produce premium products. CETA is likely to lead to wholesale use of GMOs and growth hormones over time, thus lowering forever the quality and value of Irish farm produce. Given our high production costs, if we cannot meaningfully differentiate our farm produce from our competitors, then it's goodbye to agriculture and rural Ireland as we know it. And just a short word on the environment. There is compelling evidence that the environment may be a huge casualty of CETA. Mineral exploration, including oil and gas exploration, fracking, even wind energy, all pose massive threats to our environment. The ICS mechanism has the capacity to allow corporations to circumvent sovereign governments and facilitate the willful, unrestrained destruction of our environment. In conclusion, CETA and the investor court mechanisms are a bridge too far for citizens. It's such a shame that international media has to date suppressed the truth about CETA. Professor Farrell Corcoran, former chairperson of RTE and emeritus professor of communications at DCU, put it like this in September 2016. The media are letting Ireland sleepwalk into further loss of sovereignty. Professor Corcoran says that the CETA has huge implications yet lacks coverage. There needs to be a consistent weekly reporting on all aspects of these trade deals as they move towards ratification, so that the country isn't sleepwalking again into another crisis of sovereignty. Thank you.
What's most notable about this press conference is that I think it's the first time you've seen trade groups, small businesses, farming groups, and environmental groups all sitting at the same table saying the exact same thing, which is that we need to be worried about CETA. And we would hope that our elected leaders would listen when you have this many groups all saying the same thing. I've been asked to speak about the wider implications to energy and climate policy, and particularly because Prime Minister Trudeau is arriving here this evening, I think it's worth mentioning that many people would perceive him as being very pro-climate policy. He certainly said good things when he was standing for election, and when Barack Obama was president, he talked about wanting to have a clean energy deal between the US and Canada. But since he was elected, and now since Donald Trump has become president of the United States, we've seen a real reversal in Justin Trudeau's policies on climate and energy. So already he's approved 3 oil pipelines in Canada and in the US, including the Keystone XL pipeline, which Barack Obama vetoed, but Donald Trump has brought back. And in February, Donald Trump and Justin Trudeau issued a joint statement in praise of the completion of the Keystone XL pipeline. Justin Trudeau has said that he's very pro the extraction of Canadian tar sand oil, which contains 240 gigatons of carbon. So if we are serious about keeping the Earth below 2 degrees of warming, that's half the carbon that we could burn in order to do that. So burning those tar sands has grave implications on climate, and Justin Trudeau is supporting that. And part of the Keystone XL pipeline is to help extract those tar sands, which will result in a 17% increase in greenhouse gas emissions compared to conventional oil. So we're not seeing a very pro-climate policy stance coming out of Canada. And to be honest, when it comes to climate and energy policy, Trudeau is really Trump with better hair. So that's what we're looking at in our Prime Minister. But I think CETA itself has grave implications not only on climate but also on environment in general. Attracta has spoken about the investor court dispute settlement system, and that's prevalent in other free trade agreements. So what we know from those past free trade agreements is that there have been 700 cases taken by corporations against governments, and half of those are environmentally related. So when governments have tried to protect their own environments, these corporations have sued, and 60% of those were either won by corporations or settled, which means governments paid out to these corporations in order to protect their environmental interests. So this is a risk that we are facing with CETA too, particularly because CETA has an annex where certain industries are either exempt or not exempt from protection, and Ireland has very few exemptions, so we face increased risks in terms of trying to put things like community-owned energy into public good, and other potentially public goods are now at risk under CETA. Another thing I just finally wanted to say is that the EU Commission commissioned an independent report that said that CETA would actually improve GDP in the EU by 0.02 to 0.03%, which is not very much, and indicates that CETA is actually a bad deal for Europe because Canada can outcompete us in terms of their intensification of agriculture and price. And for Ireland in particular, it's not just a bad deal, it's a horrific deal because we're so dependent on agriculture in this country. Thanks.
As you can see, our table here is very crowded, and there are a number of people sitting down who should really be at the top table, and one of those is Mark Cumming, who is the head of COLOV. So I'm kind of putting you on the spot, Mark. Would you like to add to what has been said?
Just to add, I suppose that the ISDS is a product of the post-colonial era. It is something that has been tried and tested in many countries in the global south, and it has been seen to work in the sense that it has been seen to undermine the public good in countries in the global south in the interests of global corporations typically housed in Europe and North America. So we're in the interesting situation as COLOV of normally we work on issues that are of concern to the impact of the well-being of people in the global south, but in this scenario we're working on something that we have seen elsewhere that is coming closer to home, and we're pleased to be working alongside all the groups here and many others. Just also we'd like to say, or maybe is it for the end, but next Tuesday we're launching a resource here in Buswells with the help of Senator Higgins, a resource that we want to make available to the ordinary person in Ireland, so that ordinary people can get themselves briefed and informed and raise critical questions around CETA with their public representatives. So we look forward to seeing as many of you as possible next Tuesday night. Thank you.
The discussion to the floor, if anybody would like to ask a question or to make a comment.
I'd just like to add that not alone are our beef producers being jeopardised, but our white meat producers and our tillage farmers are also in peril as a result of this, because there is an agreement to bring in a lot of pork and grain products, oilseed products and so on in from Canada, as well as I just reiterate what Cara has to say about the Canadians actually have the highest carbon footprint in the world, possibly. It's slightly above the US people, and to support that sort of regime where they're extracting and doing massive environmental degradation, whereas we're trying to protect our environment from companies that try to get in here to frack and so on and so forth. And that's why we like to see the ICS mechanism removed altogether from this agreement.
Okay. Barry Finnegan.
I am Barry Finnegan. I've been following these issues for about 20 years now, and I think it's important to identify that it's not simply civil society groups that are fundamentally opposed to this idea of investor-state dispute settlement. And just for clarity's sake, the idea is that a private company has a problem with a government law or regulation. Instead of going like a normal citizen to the domestic courts, they sue the government in private in front of arbitrators. Now, there's a lot of confusion on the government side and the European Commission side that these arbitrators are judges. The document, the 1,598 pages of CETA, is very clear that it would be desirable that they're qualified up to the level where they could be appointed as judges, but it's quite specific in the text that it says they must have extensive experience working as arbitrators in international investor-state dispute settlement. So just 3 or 4 quotes from people who are opposed to it. The European Commission itself has an internal working document from 2013 that clearly says this form of international arbitration is incompatible with the exclusive competence of the EU courts to rule on the rights and obligations of member states under EU law. We go on then and we see that the German Magistrates Association, the Association of German Judges, says that they see neither a legal basis nor a need for such a court. On top of that then, we have the European Association of Judges, who says that these provisions for the election, time of office and remuneration of judges at the investor court system do not meet the minimum standards for judicial office as laid down by the European Magna Carta, and thus it goes on. A whole series of petitions have been signed by up to 223 different legal scholars and professors around Europe. And not only that, then on top of all of that, you have the European Union's European Economic and Social Committee, who says that ICS is incompatible with the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. And thus it goes on. Just the last quote is from a chap, he's Alfred de Zayas, and he's the United Nations independent expert on the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order. And he quite clearly has stated that there is a legitimate fear that CETA will dilute environmental standards, food security and health and labour protection. And he finished up a rather detailed submission to the United Nations saying that investor-state dispute settlement and its rebranded investor court system is ontologically and conceptually flawed and fails the test of compatibility with the Charter of Human Rights. And just to finish up, one of the letters written by 101 professors of law around Europe to the European Commission says, "We have been unable to identify any evidence which you have provided as to why this system of parallel legal system is required." And so there are no examples of European or Canadian investors having their interests ridden over roughshod by judges. Capital is very well protected. There are no examples of court cases that have gone awry. And so we would call on Fine Gael and the European Commission to please try and provide us with some empirical, logical argument as to why this bizarre, quasi-judicial, as a star chamber is going to be why do they want it? And to reiterate why it's very, very clear that we believe that investor state dispute settlement is illegal under the Irish Constitution, it is illegal under European Union law. When a group of pro bono environmental lawyers asked the European Commission, we understand that you've asked for legal advice as to whether this quasi-judicial parallel process exclusively for foreign companies, we understand it's illegal under EU law and that you've obtained legal advice to this effect. And the Commission said, yes, we did receive legal advice, and this is what they gave us. 8 pages of redacted text. And so, where is the evidence that this investor court is needed? And why won't the Commission publish their legal advice? Because it seems very clear that it's not only against the idea of democracy and equality before the law, but it's not against the Irish Constitution and the European law itself. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yes, Senator Alice Mary Higgins.
Yes, so just maybe I think it's very important that in the context we're having this conference. Sorry, apologies, my voice is a little bit done. We're having this conference in a week when the Canadian Prime Minister is visiting, and I think it's very important that the message that trade with Canada is of course very welcome. Ireland has a very strong trading relationship with Canada. A trade agreement with Canada is of course potentially a very positive thing. The problem is with this trade agreement and with the way that it is framed. And specifically, we're discussing today a lot the international court system, or the specifically we're discussing today the investor court system. And the investor court system is in no way, in fact, it would be a vote of confidence in the Canadian legal system and in the Irish legal system and in the European legal systems to say that we are going to have to reject the investor court system and full ratification. Because we are confident, as was outlined, that European court systems, that Canadian court systems are entirely adequate to deal with any issues that arise of investor protection. But what investor court systems will do is take that outside of the Irish context, the European context, and place it instead in a new space. And we've talked about regulation, and I think it's very important to be clear, while existing regulations may be protected and may be protectable, new regulation, which we need if we're going to tackle the environmental challenges ahead, the economic challenges ahead, if we are going to face up to the challenges of equality in our society, to put in place robust employment law, robust environmental law, we need to be able to regulate for the public good. And it does put a question mark and a regulatory chill over public regulation. And I think it's also important to mention, we do already have WTO rules also, which will allow a state to sue a state, and there's a lot of problems with how they're implemented. But this investor court system, I believe it represented an overreach by the European Commission at a moment when they thought they could attach anything to a trade deal. We saw how it was rejected in terms of TTIP, the problem it's caused. We've seen the trouble it's caused in terms of CETA. And I think we've seen also now that new trade deals, such as the EU-Japan deal, do not include investor court systems. And if in the future Ireland, I imagine, will want this, if we want to see a trade deal between Europe and the UK, we need to recognise that this toxic element of investor court systems has to be taken out of trade. And it's going to be vitally important, I think, post-Brexit as well, that we start bringing forward trade deals which can work with citizens. And just a reason why that we know that that's going to be necessary. The European Commission told us that they didn't need to ratify this. They told us that states did not need to ratify this, that they had exclusive competence. The case was taken to the European Court of Justice and they were found to be wrong. Now they are telling us not to be concerned about any clash between European law and the investor court system. And we're saying, let's check it again. Let's check it with the European Court of Justice. Let's be sure that any investor court system or any trade deal that we pass is compatible with European law. It's a very basic check. So I would really urge the Irish government and other governments around Europe now to say, we will check this deal. We will check the investor court systems. We will run it by the European Court of Justice. And that's just a question mark. And it just allows us to wait, to see that these deals are appropriate, to design better deals. And I don't think that in any way reflects on Ireland's or Europe's friendship with Canada. It means that we're getting a better kind of trade deal for Canadians and for Irish citizens and for European citizens. So I think that's something, it's a responsibility for all of us as legislators to make sure that we do that.
Thank you very much, Senator. Professor John Sweeney would like to speak.
From the point of view of climate and environment, I just wanted to endorse what Cara said in the position of the ICSA in this debate. Economists tend to fall in love with free trade agreements because they have a mistaken belief in the Ricardian theory of comparative advantage. And in this case, I think it fails to account for the environmental costs involved in it. Canada, as has been said, has a much higher carbon dioxide equivalent per capita emission rate than even bad countries like Ireland. And therefore, with a trade deal, there is going to be a hidden carbon subsidy in Canadian exports, which will make them more competitive on a false basis with Irish produce. But secondly, of course, Canada already has a free trade arrangement with the United States, so there is a backdoor entry possibility for United States goods with even perhaps worse environmental credentials to arrive in Ireland. So the playing field is going to be far from level. My second point really relates to all the concerns about the International Court arrangements. I think these are crazy, quite honestly, and they do open up a horrible vista for many people and many countries. We know, for example, that many Canadian companies have already sued the Canadian government. We know also that Canadian mining companies have taken action already against European governments. For example, in Romania, a wish to stop gold mining by the Romanian government was opposed by a Canadian mining company. And I just wonder, with CETA in action, what would be the consequences for Croagh-Patrick, for example, where we successfully stopped gold mining a number of years ago? Would we be able to do that now with CETA in action, or would regulatory chill stop us from doing it? Thanks.
I'd just like to just clarify one point. The agreement basically needs to be ratified by all of the member states. But in advance of that, there will be what's known as a provisional application, where in fact most of the agreement will actually come into effect before our Dáil or other member states' parliaments have a chance to vote on it. The ratification process has actually already started. 3 member states at least have already voted in favour of CETA within the EU. But the provisional application is actually really critically important because ICS is not the only element. We've heard from the various sectors about their various concerns, but there are a number of different elements which will come into effect before the people of Ireland have really had a chance to understand what this deal is, or the members of our Oireachtas have had a chance to properly debate. Now that's a signal that there has been an absolute lack of democratic oversight, debate and consultation on this deal from the outset, because we're going to be subject to its effect once the provisional application comes into effect. Even in Canada, Prime Minister Trudeau is running into difficulties with ratifying at their end, and it's delaying the provisional application. But it is expected to follow in autumn. So it is really time, and it is incumbent upon all of us to become appraised of the issues here and to facilitate a full and proper debate. Finally, Commissioner Maelstrom, in advance of the debate, or just before the EU Parliament voted on it, conceded that Ireland was uniquely exposed because of the nature of the ICS element, given to what we've conceded to in the past and what we haven't. So ICS is a very, very different situation for Ireland. You can look at any IDA video. It doesn't advertise as one of the reasons to come and invest in Ireland. You can come here because you can sue us. We have been able to attract our high level of foreign direct investment without ICS. Why should we concede this now?
Okay. John Higgins from Clare, would you like to speak?
Yes, please. I've been involved in this campaign for about 3 years now. I was originally involved in the anti-fracking campaign, trying to get a ban, which is going to be signed shortly, I believe. But when I heard about the ISDS clauses in the trade deals, I became very concerned. And I figured that if we didn't get a ban in place, and all the way through the legislature, there was a strong possibility that we could be sued for to allow fracking. And I became involved in the campaign. I joined a movement called TTP Zones. Now, when I originally joined it, there was about 800 cities and municipalities involved in it, and now there's well over 2,000. And to give you some idea of the size of the cities or municipalities involved, for example, Barcelona, Madrid, even part of Brussels. You know, you have the Commission in Brussels pushing through these trade deals, and you have part of the City of Brussels rejecting these trade deals. But the real danger is the renamed ICS clause. Without a doubt, without the fracking ban in place, we could see our environment destroyed. And I'm from Clare, and the Loophead Peninsula was one of the places that was designated for fracking. Now, somebody mentioned the employment figures, and last week there was a big hoo-ha with one-liner that CETA was about jobs, whereas the Commission or the Committee on Employment and Social Issues in the European Parliament rejected CETA on the basis that there would be, and you mentioned the figures, 204,000 jobs lost, and they could allocate the job losses to country by country. Now, to back that up, Tufts University did a separate and totally independent study, and in Tufts University report it says over 200,000 jobs. Part of the problem with the trade deals and the promoters of the trade deals is that they're using a particular method of computing figures based on the fact that their starting point is full employment. Now, you take Ireland and you take whichever figure you like, whether 6 or 12 or 13. This figure is skewed, automatically skewed straight away. They're meaningless. And the other thing is, the people who drive these trade deals, we have 28 European commissioners. We have 30,000 lobbyists in Brussels. So if you just take that there's 30, you have how many lobbyists every day, talking to commissioners about the legalities of these trade deals. There's even a tour of Brussels. It's the lobby tour. It takes 4 hours to do it. There's so many of them. And these are the people who have the ear of commissioners and to some extent some of the parliamentarians. Only 93% of the meetings in Brussels are with lobbyists or representatives of corporations. 5% are NGOs and the rest are civil society groups. Now, that should tell us something. I think it should tell us about the Commission and the lack of the democratic process that's been allowed to go within the Commission. That I think we have to reclaim that, and our first step to reclaiming this is rejecting this CETA deal and saying we are rejecting it because it's affecting Daniel, everything in our society. Somebody would ask me, why am I involved in this campaign? I have grandchildren, that's why I'm involved, because, you know, if I have I've no money to leave them, but I would like to, you know, to leave them a slightly better world than the one that I came into. And we did make progress in Ireland, I have to admit. We made great progress for some time, but I think we started to move away from that in the 80s when we began to adopt neoliberal policies. This is a neoliberal policy taken to an extreme. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Would anybody else like to add? Yes.
Just a small few words. Since 2011, we've had 3 job ministers, and I don't know how much you've watched the questions that go in and the answers that they give. But since 2011, well, first of all, there's a debate to be won, and it hasn't been won, and especially with the public. And in that time since 2011, the 3 established parties in power, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, half in now, and Labour, showed no appetite for challenging big business, and that's a problem. And last week now was the first time Fitzgerald was up for questions. And you should look at her. I had a question with her on CETA, and if you look at how she answers the question, she is very loose with the facts, but so were the 2 ministers before her. And I think there should be, you should concentrate on actually what they're saying and not saying. They're not actually answering the questions that have been put to them, and they're sidestepping them, talking about something else, trying to put it into a different framework. So they're actually refusing to actually deal with the challenges that have been put to them in several areas. And I think you've got to concentrate on that and just show clearly that they actually can't answer the questions, and that they are just trying to put it into a different field in order to actually just keep going. It's about spin, not substance, and unfortunately, it's not unusual that the media hasn't bought into the story. Now, listen, they could actually, that can change sometimes very quickly. It hasn't changed yet. They haven't shown any interest in the story. How you do that? It's not so easy. It's not a story that grabs them. I don't need to tell you how the media works, but grabbing the attention of the public will invariably bring the attention of the media behind it. It doesn't, very seldom comes the other way around, and despite what people might think. And I think how you win the public debate is not easy, but I think that's the failure of the government to actually, they're getting away with actually not having to respond to the realities of what CETA and Munster, and that's something that has to be stopped if you want to make any progress.
Thank you, Mick. And just to follow up on what you've said, it has been our experience that even government ministers haven't heard of CETA. We had a meeting with the Independent Alliance before Christmas, and they weren't aware of CETA until we brought it to their attention. We had a meeting as well with the Fianna Fáil front bench, and it has also come to our attention that very senior members in the Fianna Fáil party weren't even aware of CETA. So this is something up until now that is being carried on behind closed doors, in the dark. The members of the European Parliament representing Ireland, when the document was being drafted, they didn't have access to it. So everything has been done behind closed doors. So this morning we are actually just opening back the shutters, and we are shining a light on what is happening, and we are sending out a very, very clear message from this room that farmers, business people, environmental groups, the Congress of Trade Unions and civil society are totally opposed to the government signing off on this trade deal on our behalf. And I think when that message gets through to the corridors of power, that their base is, is starting to shift. they'll kind of have a rethink about it. So I'd just like to wind up this morning's proceedings by thanking the panel here. They have travelled long distances from Wexford to Sligo and possibly further beyond to be with us this morning. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for attending. I'd like to thank the press and media for being in attendance, and I just hope that this now will be the beginning of a nationwide discussion, that every man, woman and child in the country will be aware of CETA and its implications. Thank you very much.